Hello, this is JT. I wanted to talk about two different concepts. One, the three-fifth compromise, and two, I wanted to talk about who does the Bible say colonized with Christianity? Well, we can't really say, the Bible doesn't really say who colonized with Christianity, but you will clearly see when you do a little Bible study and when you connect history, you will see who didn't do it. Okay, so now this goes back to the book of Daniel, when Nebuchadnezzar had a dream of this statue with four different metals. You know, the four different metals on the statue. One had a head of gold. One of the metals was a head of gold. One of the metals was a chest, breastplate, and arms of silver. One of the metals was a belly of bronze, and the legs were iron. And then when you got down to the feet and the toes were iron mingled with murray clay. He had this dream and he ended up finding the prophet Daniel to interpret the dream. See, Daniel prayed for God to give him the dream and the interpretation. So when Daniel came and he interpreted the dream, he told him that, the king of Nebuchadnezzar, you were this head of gold. And it turns out that these four different metals were four different kingdoms that would rule the world. Gold was Babylon, chest and metal, the arms and breastplates of silver were Medo-Persia, the belly of bronze was Greece, and then the legs of iron were Rome, and then down at the bottom, at the feet and toes, were iron mixed with murray clay. Now, murray clay represents the people of God, because it says, he says, just as this clay is in my hand, so are you, O people, for I am the potter and ye are the clay. So the clay represents the people of God, and the iron represents the iron at the bottom of the feet where. Well, let me put it this way. The legs of iron, it is weird or ironic that the legs of iron were two legs, because Rome ended up becoming divided into two because it became too vast. So they're divided, and then once Rome was divided, it was further picked apart by 10 tribes that make up divided Europe. Now, is it no wonder that at the feet and the toes were the murray clay mixed with iron, and toes, and both of the feet combined have 10 toes. So these were 10 tribes. They represented 10 tribes. Now, these 10 tribes mixed with murray clay represented the faith or the belief or the Christianity mingled with the iron. But it says like the iron and the clay didn't really mix. So this is how Christianity ended up getting spreaded. And then you had to do research to find out the names of these tribes. And none of the names of these tribes were the tribe of Greece. Now, why is that? Because the tribe of Greece, the Grecians, because it was in Greece as it was going into the Roman captivity. Like the belly of bronze represented Greece. I forgot to mention that. The belly of bronze represented Greece, and the legs of iron represented Rome. And then you got down to the bottom where the iron and the murray clay was mixed up. That was Rome being picked apart by 10 tribes as they spread Christianity. And you had to do research. They named the tribes. Now, is it any wonder that the Second Testament is written in Greek? because when Jesus came to the earth as a human, he was hung on a Roman cross. But when he first came, he spoke to the Jews, and then he spoke to some of the Jews that were living as Grecians. They were known as Hellenized Jews. And when the ministry really, really began to take off, it started off in Greece. That's why it says there is neither Jew nor Greek or Gentile, neither male or female, slave or free. You're all one in Christ Jesus, or you're all one in Mashiach Yeshua. And Greece was kind of like America at that time, because inside Greece there were a whole lot of different tribes, tongues, nations, and creeds that were living there. And they were all under the name of Grecian. So it's kind of like America here. Like, there are a whole lot of different Americas here, and America is a place, a land filled with immigrants. And a lot of us immigrated from different lands, from different nations. So it was like that in Greece. So it's no wonder that this right here, I'm going to explain why this right here is spiritual Greece. Not the actual physical Greece, but the spiritual Greece. Because the reason why the Grecians are not listed as one of the 10 tribes that spread Christianity was because they, a lot of them went into the Christian Inquisition when over 67 million Christians were persecuted by the Roman government, when they started doing all of this stuff to them to get rid of them. And then the books, then they took the scriptures, and this is where you get the Latin Vulgate from. In the Latin Vulgate, there were a lot of different changes, where these Grecians that were left, they had to live under these doctrines, where they had to live according to the scriptures there, but they were not allowed to read the Bible. Having a copy of that Bible was a death sentence, so they weren't allowed to read it. They were still speaking Greek, but the Bible was written in Latin, so they didn't understand the language. So they couldn't read it, and they had to go to a priest, and he would tell them what their punishment for sin was, or whether or not they were forgiven. But of course, when the real Bible says that only God can forgive sins, but here you have the priest forgiving sin. So they were living under a lot of false doctrines, and this lasted for 4,000 years. This was known as the Dark Ages. So they were in this Dark Age type of slavery for 1,000 years. At the same time, Christianity was being colonized or spread throughout Europe. Now, after they came out of that Dark Age period, because the Bible did mention that this would happen, that the sanctuary would be cleansed after so many days, which turned out to be so many years. It did mention that they would go through this 1,000-year period where they couldn't read the Bible. And see, when they finally began to come out of that Dark Age period in around 1517, I believe, when it was Martin Luther penned his 95 Theses on the wall of stating all of these things that were wrong with the scriptures. And then someone, I think it was like Erasmus, he put the Greek New Testament side by side with the other churches' text, and he saw, it showed what they were doing, and it showed what they should be doing. So this was the movement that began, the Protestant movement, where they were protesting to follow the scriptures the way they were supposed to. This is known as the Protestant movement. This is where it came from. Now, it was these people who were in this Protestant movement, along with a whole bunch of others that were brought over into the American lands for many different reasons. Some, just scooped up and brought over to pay off their trip, where they wanted to get all the thieves and vagabonds off the roads or whatever, get them out of that land and put them over here and let them work. Some just came over because they come over here looking for opportunity to own land, have their own land. I guess that was the American dream at the time, to own your own land, And they found out it wasn't that easy. So, it took maybe, let me see, from 15, when they started coming over here, maybe 15, 17, 15, 19, something like that. And, all the way up until, in the 1700s, where they had the Revolutionary War. And they won the Revolutionary War because, they came over, they had a lot of, issues that they had to deal with, you know. But the main straw, one of the main straws, like we know it as the shot heard around the world, Crispus Attucks. But if you look at what happened with the Bible, I believe that this is the spiritual act that caused a lot of stuff to start happening. The Bible was, the King James Version came out in 1611, and many versions came out before then, but this was the one that stuck. Like, this was the one that was allowed to go past, to where they didn't have to rewrite it or change it. And it went all the way to 1769 when certain books were taken out of it, when it was changed. And then I believe it was something after that, it led to the spark, the shot heard around the world. It led to the Declaration of Independence, which was a declaration of war in 1783. I'm sorry, 1769. 1776 was the Declaration of War. And then in 1783, the war is over. And then in 1791, there's a Constitution is ratified. Now, if you notice, you will see that from 1769 to 1776 is 7 years. From 1776 to 1783 is 7 years. And from 1783 to 1791 is another 7 years. Now, what's so special about the number 7? 7 is a special number in the Bible. It's the number of God's completion. For in 6 days he created the earth, and on day 7th he rested. A lot of believers, or a lot of people who study the Bible, know the significance of number 7 being God's number, because it's God's number of completion. So to me, it's no wonder that this war is not known as being holy war based, because when they defeated those who came here in 1492 and began to set up, when they lost the country to the colonists turned this into a Christian nation and made this a place where the Bible could be what it was meant to be, which was freedom. Galatians 5:1 says, "Stand fast in the liberty where Christ made you free, and be not entangled again with the yoke of bondage." It's because they were sick and tired of kings and priests, enslaving them using the word. And they found out whenever the kings and priests get together, and you don't have the high priest, Yeshua, Jesus Christ, over it, whenever the politics and religion get together, people end up getting enslaved. So they made this a type of government where it was a separation between church and state to protect the church from the state, and also so that the church could be protected by the state. Yeah, go figure that. And so you'll see that these were the descendants that came out of that Grecian 1,000-year period of darkness. That's why I refer to this as spiritual Greece. So people think that the Grecians were the ones that spread or colonized Christianity. They could not have been, because they were in a dark age period, Bible slavery at that time. So we see that a lot of stuff that we believe is wrong, and you can verify this by checking this out in history. And some people will try to muddle history. I know that there is what you call a disinformation network is what they call it. There's a disinformation network out there. That's where they are distorting truth. So you really, really have to search and dig. And if you search and dig, you will find the actual truth itself. Okay. Now, the other thing I wanted to explain was the truth about the 3/5 compromise, because a lot of people do not understand 3/5 compromise. I remember as I grew up, I would always hear the 3/5 compromise had something to do with me being 3/5 of a person, or 3/5 of citizen, or if you're 3/5 of a citizen, then that means you're 2/5 of a slave. But when you actually look at the law book, that's not what it says at all. I think it's Article 3, Section 2, or Article 1, Section 3 of the Articles of Confederation, where it's talking about representatives that would be appointed, for states, because at this time, the number of representatives that a state could have depended on how many people lived in that state. So for the purposes of representation, they were not allowed to count the entire slave population. They could only count every 3 out of 5 slaves for the purposes of representation. That's what it really means. It had nothing to do with the value or the worth of an individual. And it's pretty easy to verify, and I'll tell you why. Because there were times in the North where there was minimal to no slavery in the North, and they could literally take people to court. And what they would do is they would sue them in court. And if they ever lost a case, the only time that I can remember that someone was saying that a case had been lost, it was the Dred Scott decision, because he won his case locally. But when they took his case to the Supreme Court, they overruled his case and said that, he didn't have the right to sue because black people weren't really citizens, they were property. Now, if that law meant that he was 3/5 of citizen, then legally he would have been able to ask for 3/5 of whatever he was asking for. Matter of fact, during all of the cases or trials, any one of them could have asked that question, even if they said no, even if they had to tell them that's not what the law meant. They could have legally asked for it, especially if they had lawyer representation or a lawyer talked to them and said, well, if that's what the law said, if that's what it meant, they would have told them, well, you're 3/5 a citizen. If you can't sue for everything that you're suing for, then you could at least legally ask for 3/5 of your stuff, and they wouldn't have had any legal grounds to say no. But there's not one case in the law book where a person that sued asked for 3/5 of his stuff, because that's not what the law says. That's not what it says. It had nothing to do with the value or worth of an individual. And that's very easy to verify, because if you look in history, you're not going to find one case where a black person went and sued somebody in court and even thought, even as a joke, to ask for 3/5 of his property or 3/5 of what he's supposed to be getting. That never happened. So these were just some things that we are terribly mistaken about, because one of the reasons that I do this or I mention this is because a lot of us, we're stuck focusing on how we got enslaved, how our ancestors got enslaved, but very few people are focusing on how we got free. Because it was this country becoming a Christian nation, having that supreme document that they spent like 4 years ironing out, called the Constitution, and all of the laws, the amendments sitting on top of that Constitution. So without the Constitution, 60 something years later, the 13th Amendment would have never been possible. That's the reason why we're free, because of the 13th Amendment. That's the reason why chattel slavery is illegal, because that document sits on top of the Constitution. That's the reason why slavery is illegal. Slavery is not illegal because of June 19th. June 19th just happened to be the day that our ancestors got the news that they were no longer legally slaved and were able to walk off the plantation. So, and many of us, we seem to hate the things that are for us. And that's actually a trick of the devil. They hate, to be for what's against you and to be against what's for you. Because Satan wants you to think that your enemies are your friends and your friends are your enemies. How do we know that? Because in Genesis 3, he tells Eve, or implies to her, if you disobey God, you get to be just like him. Did God really say that you can't eat that? And no. You can't, Did God really say that you shouldn't eat from all the trees in the garden? From every tree in the garden? It's like got that. Did God say you shall not eat from every tree in the garden? He's like, And this is like, no, God just don't want you to do that because he knows when you eat that fruit, you're going to be just like him. So he wants you to think that what's for you is against you and what's against you is for you. And that comes right out of the garden. So it's mind twisting, mind boggling stuff. And this stuff is easily verifiable. So because, you know, people stood up for the principles of the Bible, that's the reason why the platform was created for slavery to be made illegal. So, you know, I mean, I know it's a lot of stuff is muddled and jumbled up, but you have the law of polarity. It's a scientific law, which means for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. So there's a side of this that's looking at the negative, and there's a side of this that's looking at the positive. What do you get? You get what you focus on. If you focus on the negative, your intention will be towards the negative. And that's where the devil wants to pull your attention towards the negative stuff instead of towards the positive stuff. You know, it's just like when you got your naysayers that's trying to get your attention, that's trying to get you focused on something else and trying to take your focus off of where it belongs. You know, that's when he says that, you know, you have to be hyper intentional on what's good for you and ignore the distraction. So this is JT.